So I've just finished reading the first two books of my themed month TBR of catching up on the books that, are on my TBR pile that need to be read, that might have otherwise been neglected over the time where I'm reading other themed books. So the first two books that I read were the gay books, I guess. The first one that I read is Ernesto by Umberto Saba, and the second one is Dancer from the Dance by Andrew Holleran. Now, both of these books are sort of, I guess you could call them gay classics in their own way. Perhaps this one is more well known than this one, and this one again is being re-released in a new edition with a nice cover from Vintage, and they're making a bigger thing about it, especially I guess now for this month since it's Pride Month. I want to start first with Ernesto because this was the first one that I read and I absolutely loved this book. I think this could be probably one of my favourite reads of the year. It was just a really wonderful reading experience, I guess. I also want to say that in my TBR video, I talked about this photo, which I really like the photo, and I said I hope this wasn't the age gap. It's not. This is actually Umberto Saba himself. This is the author of the book, and this is just, I guess, a random person from the public. So it's a photograph of him in his old age, which I guess was a little bit deceiving at first. However, if I had just actually read the back bit where it talks about the photo credit, then I would have known. Anyway, so this book is actually unfinished. So it was never finished, and technically it was never really supposed to have been printed. What's nice about this particular edition is that not only does it have the novel itself, or the novella, the half finished, but it also has notes from the translator, giving you a bit of an insight into Umberto Saba's life, but then also letters that Saba had written whilst he was writing this book, which kind of, in a way, has their own story, and it tells their own version of events, of not only the events in this book, but of the events surrounding the writing of the book. And I think that it definitely enhanced the experience, and I possibly couldn't quite imagine then reading just the story without those bits attached. However, the story itself was also like a 5-star read to me. It was just somehow the additional bits gave it a 6 stars perhaps, like an even higher level of appreciation for it. So the story follows our main character Ernesto. It starts when he's a teenager. I think he's about 16, and he has this sort of sexual relationship / awakening with an older guy who's working at the same place that he's working at. And then it kind of just follows Ernesto growing up, ultimately, in Trieste, in Italy. It's interesting because it was set in Trieste whilst it was under the sort of Austrian colony, I guess. And so it has this additional depth of national identity, nationalism, being Italian, being Triestean, if that's the word for it, but also like the class systems of language that are involved in this. Now, of course, we're just reading the translated version, so we don't actually have the dialect that the book itself was written in, or parts of the book were written in, but I think the translator has done quite a good job here to let the reader know when somebody is talking in dialect, and even subtly giving you the context as to why and what that actually represents in reference to the sort of discussion of class in this book. Really loved it. It was a lot different to actually what I was expecting it to be. I thought it was going to be solely focused on this relationship that we see at the start. However, it does actually evolve quite separately from that, and it explores Ernesto's growing up in a really mature and interesting way. And it's quite sad the way that it ends, not because it ends in a sad way, but because, I don't know, you feel like you really get to know Ernesto as like a real person, and knowing that his story never actually came to an end because the book wasn't finished, it was abandoned, and because of that, you're just on like the cusp of I don't know, almost heartbreak for Ernesto not being able to live the life that he was supposed to live, even though I know he's not real, but that's how it felt like. And you knew it wasn't going to end, because it got to a point, I think, when this was being written, where I think even Saba himself knew that he wouldn't be able to finish it, for reasons that we perhaps don't know, but are kind of explored a little bit in the letters afterwards. So there is a part in this where it kind of gives you a glimpse into what could happen for Ernesto's life, but says how it's not going to be written. And there's something about that that's just so poignant, and it was so upsetting, and it just left the book like haunting me with this really beautiful life that wasn't ever lived. And yeah, I just really, really, really love this book. And then I read Dancer from the Dance. I did read Song of Sorrow in between, just because I think I needed something a little bit, not to say that Song of Sorrow is lighter, but a little bit less immersive in quite a turbulent mindset, perhaps. Dancer from the Dance follows a man called Malone and this older, I guess, drag queen / man called Sutherland, who sort of adopts Malone and indoctrinates him into the gay scene of New York City in the 70s. So from there it kind of explores the gay circuit of specific clubs in Fire Island, and it explores that side of gay culture. I gave this book a 3.5 stars. It wasn't a bad book. It definitely wasn't bad in the way that I was wary of, because there were a few things that I thought might not be to my liking. And I mean, well, one of the things was, and that was the fact that it was just solely focused on this one part of the gay community, and that it kind of glamorized it in a way that I just don't feel like. I feel like it was very stereotypical, but I will admit that it did also kind of at times critique it a little bit, but I don't think it really critiqued it as well as it should have, or as much as it could have. The reason that it's a very well written book, and I think, and I can absolutely see why people do love it, because there is a lyrical beauty to it, and there are moments that are really quite poignant. I can also see the themes that Holleran was trying to make apparent to the reader, and some of the ideas behind the book, I think, are quite intriguing and quite poignant at the same time. It's definitely a book of its time. It's definitely a book of the 70s, and I think it perhaps isn't as relevant today as it would have been then, of course, but I think I've seen a lot of reviews where people are talking about the relevancy of this book still, and I just don't think it's true, and I don't think it's very representative of like the diverse queer community that we do have. There was a really weird obsession with Puerto Ricans in this book, because they just kept on, like, it was very specific that there was this character who was Puerto Rican, but they just kept on coming. And I think that's another thing that I took an issue with, is that there was so much repetition in this book, and that even when things were explained beautifully, they kept on getting explained, and it would be like 3 or 4 pages of explaining one thing, and I was like, oh, come on, I don't need that much detail. I think I have seen people saying that actually the cyclical, repetitive nature of this book is an interesting tool to solidify a theme, but there's ways of kind of repeating cycles of being that are new and fresh each time, and kind of more subtle, whereas this one, it was literally just the same thing happening over and over again, and I was just like, it's a bit boring, not gonna lie. So I feel quite on the fence about it. I don't think I'm gonna praise it to be like the definitive queer novel. Perhaps it could be of that generation. Again, I will admit that, and I think a lot of men, older gay men, will really relate to this and really find it kind of speaks to them perhaps not me personally. So I see its worth, and I know that some of the things that I didn't like about this book are because of my personal taste. You know, I'm getting much more into reading smaller novellas, books that are just a bit more to the point and kind of don't dilly-dally with too many descriptions, just telling me what I need to know. This book doesn't do that. It is very rich in its kind of descriptive nature, and I think that a lot of people would really enjoy that. Not me personally. There were parts of it though that I did really enjoy. There were some descriptions which were perfect and which were really beautiful and really evocative. It just wasn't for me, but still a very good book, and I can appreciate that. So it's quite nice to have these books together, because actually in some ways they do explore similar themes, especially in the role of youthfulness in gay society, and this the idea of young male beauty. Both of them explore that in quite different ways, and I think and it was nice to be able to then compare and contrast the way that they did explore it. Both books again are actually of their time, so there's a lot in this book that is very representative of sort of pre-war Trieste, with the whole issues of Italian nationalism, but also the Austrian influences and the Germanic influences in language, etc. Whereas this one was very much about the sex and drugs of the 70s, with the music and the people and that sort of glamorous Upper East Side New York lifestyle. This one felt very much just like your very stereotypical gay white novel, which would make sense because it was written before we had these sort of notions of the intersectionality of the queer world. But this book, I think perhaps didn't have that, just because it had the nuance of the context that it was written in. I definitely would recommend them. I reckon I could probably recommend Dance from the Dance to a wider selection of people than Ernesto, but Ernesto is just such a beautiful, beautiful story that loved it. Anyway, so that's my reviews for those two books. I'm going to start Wondersmith tonight, actually, so hopefully a review for the next two books will be up soon, and I'll see you then for another video. Bye bye.